Welcome to Collision, the podcast where we discuss the fun and sometimes complicated collision of real life and trusting God. If you're curious or confused about how to engage the world we live in, we hope our conversation here helps. Now, let's get into this episode of Collision.
All right, well, welcome to the Collision Podcast. I'm Matt Manning, and I'm with James Johnson today. James, the Eras concert movie just came out this last weekend. Tell me, what is the song that you jam out to that's Taylor Swift when no one's around?
The haters are going to hate, but I'm just going to shake it off.
That's quite the image in my mind of you dancing in your house when Gretchen's gone, just shaking it off.
It's horrifying, Matt. Yep.
Yes. Yeah, it's not anything that we need to see on this podcast today, so we will spare everybody that. Today on Collision, we're not talking Taylor Swift, but we are talking digital. And last time we were together on this podcast, actually you weren't here, it was John Gross and I, we talked about how when it comes to the digital stuff of our lives, like Facebook and Snapchat and even digital media, that the reality is that for most of us, we tune in because we think it's a connections engine. We use it to connect with other people, when the reality is that they were actually designed to be an attention-grabbing engine. And the more that your attention is beholden, the more anger that you show, the more response that you have, the more money advertising dollars come in. And so we started that conversation last week really from kind of a philosophy standpoint. And today we're going to get way more practical and really talk about the digital relationships that we have and how we navigate those. And the reality is that this isn't like too different than what's been in the past. Maybe a different medium, but not too different, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So, Matt, one of my kind of observations is that through TV sitcoms and entertainment, that we've actually been engaging digital friendships for a long time. I mean, if you think all the way back to like the TV show Cheers when I was a kid, or Friends, or The Big Bang Theory, or How I Met Your Mother, like how we tuned in weekly and we actually interacted, and Sheldon Cooper would annoy us, or Ross Bing would be that annoying friend in your life, but you know, he's your buddy at the coffee shop, so you kind of dealt with him. And like we thought we were being entertained, but emotionally, and even at a deeper level, we were connecting and cultivating friendships through this medium that we thought was simply entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally relate to that. You know, growing up as a 90s kid, Saved by the Bell was the big thing, right? And every Saturday I was up watching Zach and Screech and AC Slater, you know, and Kelly and the whole crew, and, you know, living and dying in terms of the relationships that were going on there. It's not just like sitcoms, though, right? Like, I think in a lot of ways we have this in our relationship to news, and particularly the news media today.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of my vivid memories when I was a new Christian was that all the older people that were like pouring into me and helping me understand the Bible were so gracious when it came to talking about Jesus and about the New Testament and the love of God. But it was interesting because if they talked about culture or politics, they became a different person. Like their language changed. They were harsh. And what I realized was they were all offline listening to a radio guy named Rush Limbaugh back in the day. And you know, some of his values aligned with Christian values, but he was shaping so many Christians' emotions and their worldview far more than maybe the Jesus of the Bible or the authors of the New Testament. But so many Christians that I was interacting with were actually being radically influenced by someone that wasn't even a professed Christian and wasn't even a friend in their life. Just a digital connection.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot too, even like taking it a step further now that we're kind of in this age of podcasts, right? And podcasts are everywhere. And, you know, I'll find myself talking to a guy my age or whatever, and as I'm listening to him, I'm like, hey, you sound a lot like the Kelsey brothers. you know,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
you know, your views align really closely to Joe Rogan. And the reality is that all of us, when it comes to the digital media and the voices that we listen to, the shows that we watch, actually shape and influence who we are. And maybe how have you like noticed that in your own life? You certainly use that like an example of, you know, as a Christian, young Christian, seeing it in others. Have you been able to like introspect, see how that's impacted your own life?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's like you. I have a handful of pastors that I like to listen to, and I typically like how they handle the scriptures and how they unpack God's truths. But what I realized probably 6-8 months ago was that a couple podcasts that I was listening to, that the attitudes and even the fearful response to culture or the sarcasm, which I'm a big fan of sarcasm, but I saw that they were actually coloring my personality and my worldview in ways that I was struggling to not be that kind of guy, but that they were actually encouraging me to be that guy.
Yeah.
So I actually quit listening to some people that I enjoyed, that I actually aligned with a lot of their views, but that they were actually kind of spinning me to not be the kind of person that I wanted to be.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What would you say like what was that moment like when did you realize that, hey, these guys, and one of the guys or somebody that you and I both listened to, and we both kind of made the decision at the same time, unbeknownst to each other, or it was like, you know what, I don't know that this guy, even though he's a Christian, even though he speaks truth, but the way that he says things, the attitude that he has towards culture, it was like, man, we this isn't good for me. And, you know, for me, I remember having kind of that like moment as I was actually looking at a world event and something that he had spoken on. And as I was looking at the world event and the way that he was speaking about it, where I saw my heart breaking, I felt a lot of anger towards him, or from him, I should say. And in that moment, it was like, man, how much has that begun to really shape the way that I'm living? And so for me, it was like this introspective moment when I was watching something, and the way that my heart was aligning was not aligning with the way this guy was aligning. And I went back to one of the strong digital voices in my life is John Piper. Mm-hmm. And John Piper has this great quote. He says, if you look at sin in this world and you're driven to anger, then you're nothing more than a Pharisee. That's the way that Pharisees, they saw sin in the world and it drove them to anger, either anger towards the person or anger at the culture or whatever. But he says, if you look upon the sin of this world and your heart breaks, then you're beginning to have the heart of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of that awakening moment for me where I felt my heart breaking for what I was watching, and yet I was hearing anger in this person that I admired. And I just thought for a season, I think that I just need to step away from this. And so what did that look like in your life?
Yeah, same experience in a lot of ways, Matt. Like there were some things going on in the culture, and I've always looked at kind of my response to politics and cultural things of the Christian path has historically been humility, submission, unless we're asked to do something that actually dishonors God. And I noticed in some of the voices that I was listening to almost a rallying to take on the empire spirit. Yeah. And so it affected me in the head first, and you know, I questioned that, but then I noticed kind of a rally cry of like, yeah, let's unite and go after them. And I felt myself being pulled in a direction that was contrary to what I understand a follower of Jesus from the New Testament, how we should actually respond, and how historically Christianity has responded has been through humility, submission, and not taking on culture oftentimes, but just noticing a departure in my own heart, and for me to realize in the same way that if I had a friend in my life that was trying to lure me to do things that I wouldn't want to do, that I'd be like, bro, you're not good for me. Like I literally got to that place with certain podcasts and just click the unfollow button, right? Right. And kind of felt this headspace open up, and I was able to refill that with with individuals who actually encourage me to walk the way of Jesus in a way that's in greater alignment with who I want to be and what the Bible actually says we should walk in.
Yeah. Just a couple of weeks ago, you preached a great message as part of a friendship series that we were doing, really on what does it look like to unfriend. And you used 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, the whole idea of not being unequally yoked. And you spoke through what that looked like and what that meant. And a lot of the practical application of that sermon was in the, flesh-to-flesh relationships that I would call, right? The friendships that maybe are not leading us in places that we want to. And one of the things that after that sermon that we talked about is that it would be really great to have that same conversation only in the digital realm. In some ways, it's much more easier to unfriend, quote unquote, someone in the digital realm. And yet the reality is that we find ourselves oftentimes stuck, just like you and I were just talking about, whether it be listening to podcasts or, a particular news channel or, whatever it is, right? Reading blogs of people who really would be digital connections, digital friendships that maybe even mentors of ours, who are in these like one-way digital relationships. And this is something you've given a lot of thought to. And so when you think of like one-way digital relationships, like just like put that in context for me and everybody who's listening.
Sure. So for me, what that means is it's a relationship where there isn't dialogue. So I am on the receiving end, and there actually isn't a healthy platform for us to clarify what the person meant or even disagree. Like I'm literally sitting in a place of just receiving, and the person on the other end is the driver, which in physical relationships is abuse, right? So like there's horrific examples of that. But in a digital realm, we subject ourselves to influences where I think of years ago, I never watched an episode, I'm pretty proud of it, but Keeping Up with the Kardashians, right? And how many people took the bait and actually tried to keep up with people that were building an empire based on a desire for you to somehow be a part of their world. But let's face it, you're not. You're not in their world. None of that money's coming your way, right? You're being used in a one-way relationship.
Yeah, you are the consumers in that moment of a lifestyle that they're trying to build. There's not really a relationship from you to them, right? It's just they have the platform, they're pushing it forward, and you're the receiver or the consumer of it in that way. Yeah, I think for me, like as I've looked, through my life, there have been, seasons where I've listened to, again, people or preachers and feel like for a season that has been, that God really used that to shape in my life. But then, and so there's a positive aspects of that, but then there are also these negative moments that come. And, one of the things that I've realized is, in the digital world, one of the great things about the digital world is that we have more access to people and to their thoughts and to great thinkers, great theologians, great philosophers than we've ever had before. And yet all of that also comes with a great level of discernment. And it's one thing to be able to sit down and to read a book on, a philosophy and to be able to interact, and then for you and I to have a conversation over this philosophy and to really interact around these authors' thought. It's another thing for me to put in the AirPods and listen to someone espouse to me and not be able to have the conversation back.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a place that we really find ourselves in today is like there's a lot of hearing of what's going on out there. There's a ton of content to have access to, and yet at the same time, it feels like discernment, particularly in the digital space, is pretty much at an all-time low.
Yeah, and our desire to engage is really complicated. Like I had this experience just a few months ago where one of my old friends on Facebook, she posts pictures of everything, right? So everything her kids do, all their family vacations, the glass of wine by the river, right? Like everything. And it's in your feed and you just kind of scroll through it. But what I noticed over time was I started like thinking, like anytime I would see her post, I'd be like, my life kind of sucks, or I'm not as good of a parent or provider as someone else, or my kids are not as accomplished as somebody else's.
Yeah.
And I kind of stepped away and I thought about that and thought, you know what? I don't know why she posts. It could be that she's grossly insecure. And so she's working really hard to project this. It could be that her life really is that awesome and good for her. It could be that I'm actually pretty selfish at a deep level and I don't celebrate well with people, which is probably true as well. But there was so much going on that I need to discern that the healthiest thing for me to do was to step away from the relationship. So seeing those posts was not actually helping me discern what was going on in my heart. Yeah. So I needed to actually stop the noise to kind of create space to ask God, like, hey, God, what's going on there? Because I've even considered like not tithing so I can provide better vacations for my family, right? Which isn't me, right? It's like you know. So, but it led me down some really dark places. But I had to turn off the one-way communication because it was doing something toxic inside of me.
Yeah, no, that's really good. You know, I think that one of the things that you and I listened to was The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, a podcast that was put out about a church that was pretty influential through the 2010 to probably 2016. And then it had this quick fall, literally going off a cliff kind of fall to it. And I think what was really good about that podcast, it was kind of like an investigative podcast, but it elicited all of these emotions in there and in me, right? And I think that one of the great things about it is that for you and I, almost weekly after we listened to the new podcast, we would have a pretty vibrant conversation about what it was that we were listening to. And I think one of the things that taught me in that is just the value of, you know, the face-to-face, the flesh-to-flesh relationships that we have. That one-way relationships, that there's nothing inherently wrong about them. You know, people have influence in our lives. Like we said, it goes before social media existed. People had influence in our lives. We allow that in our lives, but do those become the driving factors of influence in our lives? Or is it, you know, the flesh on flesh, we sit down, we connect in ways that are wholesome and good, and where we're looking at each other, right? And where you could go, whoa, 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 or I could go, whoa, 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 you know, and work out what it is that we're thinking and feeling. I think that when it comes to the digital relationships, and maybe, you know, the permission, quote unquote, to unfollow, is around the question, like, you know, when you're in that one-way digital relationship, does it make you anxious? You know, do you find yourself walking away more angry? Is there a sadness in you that's created? During certain points, do you wish that you could like step up and speak out and act out because that person is not actually aligning, and you in those moments realize that there's actually nothing you can do? I think if those are the type of emotions that you're feeling in a one way, and you kind of feel like you're backed into a corner, like I don't know that that's what God wants for you. I don't know if that's the best that God wants for you, is every time you leave this person that you feel angry. You know, in fact, you know, Scripture tells us that we're to not be angry, you know, and that we're to put away all malice and anger and hatred towards other people. And so if there's digital relationships that I'm listening to that are ultimately leading me down that road, Scripture says, get away from those, walk away, run away from those things.
Absolutely. Well, and I think of our last political cycle and the COVID experience, right? Like how all of us had some friends online, even family members that kind of drank the crazy juice, right? I mean, people that we loved were posting things, and I don't know about you, but a couple times in the chat, I tried to lovingly say, well, there's really wise people that actually see that differently, or from a different angle, and it never ended well. It was like, right? It was like it blew up into hate speech, and you're this and you're that, and it was just like, and that was such an eye opener to me of, like the ability for us to not get face to face and have a human interaction, even doing it in a chat, is toxic in our culture, to where I think you and I could get together and go on a walk or sit down and even end a conversation seeing something from different angles and still love and respect each other and actually be better men because we talked about it. But in that digital space, I just don't see the environment for us to be able to resolve that. So I think wisdom teaches us, then just be careful in that playground, right?
Yeah.
Like build the right boundaries for you so that you don't get sucked into something beyond you.
Yeah. And so I think, last week as John and I wrapped down, one of the questions that I asked him and, from his insight, and I'd like to hear your side of things as well, is that when it comes to the digital space, particularly I would say with the people that we're involved in, there seems to be a depressing of the social media in our lives. Like there's this thing within all of us that has maybe realized what social media is, that it's not entirely good for us, that there is some benefit to being on there, but to not be consumed with it. And so in these one-way relationships, certainly we've talked about some of them are good, right? I know that Timothy Keller has played a huge influential role in your life in a very one-way relationship. John Mark Comer would be another guy that you've spoken about often that, at least to my knowledge, you don't have a personal relationship with. You have a digital one. That's one way that has served you well. And so I guess my two questions is, how do you cultivate those relationships? How are you discerning what to listen to? And then two, as you kind of have diminished some of the other voices in your life, have you replaced that with anything else that is bringing you life? You're putting away the person that makes you angry, but then what are you doing in your life to actually fill you?
Yeah, it's really good, Matt. And a part of it is, I'm a bit older than you too, so like I'm curious if part of it is just kind of me. I don't know, like I'm only a couple of years from wearing a bathrobe to church, and right, but I find when I find an influence that engages me and I'm excited, it propels me to actually find out who their influences are. So. You mentioned Timothy Keller and John Mark Comer. Like, I'm super curious. I almost listen to them now to listen to what books they're reading and who they're listening to, because I appreciate what's going on in their heart, and I want some of that too. So it kind of going to the stream of fresh water that they're drinking from has been really healthy for me. And really what that does is it actually it helps me cultivate a bigger circle of good people, because to hang out with digitally hang out with not only Tim Keller, but Tim Keller's 5 favorite people in the world. Dude, that's a pretty great group of friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really one of the things, I've been reading through Keller's biography that was released just a few months before he passed. And, through it is kind of like this weaving of relationship through his life, from Elizabeth Elliot, who, is this amazing missionary, and to, others that I could speak to. But, I found that as I read that biography, it actually led me to Elizabeth Elliot. Somebody just released kind of a 2-part biography of her life. And it's like, okay, these are people that I admire, like, and that's like you said, right? Like, I'll never be able to get to hang out with Tim Keller and Elizabeth Elliot, but man, I can read the stuff and see how they related to God and what brought them into freshness and relationship and vibrancy with God. And I can look at that and go, man, like, what does that look like in my own life? And one of the things that I so admire, that I've heard both John Mark Comer and Tim Keller speak about, is their regular rhythm of reading scriptures. Timothy Keller had a regular rhythm of reading through the Bible every year. In fact, there were some years of his life that he would read through the Bible in its entirety twice a year. And so, at the age of 65, he had read through the Bible some 70 times in his life. And there is just a wellness of spring there that comes from engaging God's word, and to realize that we can have real relationship, not a digital one with God, but real relationship with Jesus in that. And, I think one of the other practices that I've started to, and we talked about this a couple times ago, but really is, like this need of connection that culture continues to push on, and how the answer of our need for connection really is through the digital space, right? That's the promise. And I'm just starting to realize how much I really value the silence and solitude, of sitting in the presence of God and allowing that to satisfy my soul.
Yeah.
Even in other relationships of being with people, whether we're talking or not, but being in the presence of people who I greatly admire, and the way that feeds my soul. And so that's one of the practices that I've thought about in my own life of how, of how I'm seeking connection, both through face-to-face conversation, but also just by being in the presence of those who have greatly influenced me.
That's so good. Well, and one of our heroes, Henry Nouwen, said that silence and solitude, like spending that time alone with God, is actually the gateway to true community and friendship. Because when you sit with God and you get your identity from Him, the reality is it allows you to go back into community, to be friends with people, and not need to get anything from them.
Yeah.
So, and how many of our human interactions are us feeding our insecurity and our hunger, where what he said is, if you get that from God first and foremost, then you can be the husband to your wife who is actually there to love and serve her, and you can be a parent that your identity is not coming from your kids' successes, or you can be a pastor or an accountant or whatever your profession, and you can go to the workplace literally there to love other people and to do your job with excellence, because you're actually being fed by the source of life Himself.
Yeah. Oh, man, that is so good. And I think that's an appropriate place for us to put a period on this conversation. As we move forward, James, this is the last podcast. We've completed season 1 of Collision. And so we are taking November and December to really start to begin to plan next year. And so if you are enjoying this podcast, I think we have 16 or 17 podcasts that we put out this year that you can go back and listen to. And you and I, the plan is to be back in January.
Yep.
So by that time, the Avalanche should have firm control of the Western Conference, and the Nuggets should be on their way to a second championship. Christmas will be behind us, and so we will be looking at our bodies, wondering what workouts look like. And so that's when we're going to be back. So beginning of January. So if you love the podcast, we just want to thank you for listening to this entire season. You can subscribe to this wherever podcasts are found, and that way when we're back in January, you don't miss it. Any final words from you today, James?
No, it's been a super fun, just us engaging and even having a platform, Matt, to talk. We're still pastors, but to kind of reveal, I don't know, some of our vulnerabilities a little bit more than we can while preaching, and oftentimes in that setting. So we've enjoyed being vulnerable and brutally honest about some things, and we hope this has been beneficial for you.
Yeah. Well, with that said, we will see you in 2 months.
Thank you for listening to Collision. This podcast is a production of Crossroads Church in Thornton, Colorado. For more excellent content, please visit crossroadsabc.com.